at 11:47 and 41 seconds on a Thursday. A hospital, a water treatment plant, 40,000 homes. I know the exact second because I was watching it begin. I had been watching the thing that caused it for 11 days, and I had not told a single person. And when I finally moved, I moved not to warn anyone, but to send one message under my own name that would let the rest of my life go on looking the way it had always looked. I stopped the cascade. That's the part people know. That's the part in the report. What I want to tell you is the other part, which is that the message I sent wasn't the brave thing. The brave thing would have been a phone call on day 1, or day 3, or day 6. The message I sent was the cheap thing, sent at the last possible second, and the reason I sent it is not the reason anyone believes. I was 47 then. I'm 63 now. I have carried this for 16 years, and I have never said it out loud, and I'm saying it now because the countdown I've been watching in my head is almost over, and I don't know if that will change anything, but I want the story to exist somewhere outside me before it does. I worked for a regional grid operator. I won't name the company, because the people who trusted me don't deserve to be pulled into a stranger's video, and because parts of what happened are still being argued in rooms I am no longer invited into. What I can tell you is that I had what we called deep read access. I couldn't issue commands from my terminal, but I could see everything, every substation, every intertie, every demand curve, every automated decision the software was making without asking a human. For most of 21 years, I thought of that access the way a good archivist thinks about the key to a locked room. It wasn't power. It was trust. Trust that I wouldn't look where I shouldn't. Trust that I would look where I should. I used to be proud of the distinction. I was good at it. That was part of the problem. Our building was a flat gray rectangle next to a feed co-op in a town most people drive past without slowing. From the outside, you'd think it was a dentist's office that had given up on advertising. Inside, the quiet had a specific quality, not library quiet, more like the quiet of a place where the machines are the main inhabitants and the humans are guests. We had a wall of big monitors, a ring of personal desks, and a coffee maker nobody had properly cleaned in 6 years. The carpet was that industrial loop that hides stains and refuses to hold any warmth. I remember the carpet because I spent a lot of time staring at it during the 11 days. The pattern I saw on a Monday afternoon in late August was small. You have to understand how small. We had a predictive model that forecasted load against available generation and updated every 4 seconds. When the forecast and the actual began to drift apart by more than a certain margin, it flagged. What I noticed wasn't a flag. It was a rhythm underneath the flags. The model was off by tiny amounts in the same direction at the same times of day, and the corrections it was making were getting larger each cycle to compensate. It's the kind of thing you only see if you've been staring at those numbers for 21 years, and your eyes have started reading them the way other people read a spouse's mood. Nothing alarming on any single screen. Just a feeling underneath that the floor was tilted half a degree. I remember the exact moment I decided not to say anything. I was holding a ceramic mug with a chip in the rim. I looked over at Denise, who ran my shift, and she was on the phone with her son about a forgotten permission slip. She was using the voice she used for her son, the one that was both impatient and soft, and I thought, this isn't the moment. I'll bring it up in the morning stand-up. I'll have more data by then. That was the first lie. It didn't feel like one. It felt like professionalism. In the morning stand-up, I said nothing. I told myself I wanted another 24 hours of data. That was the second lie, and it also didn't feel like one, because I did pull more data, and I did stare at it until my eyes hurt, and I did build a little side script to track the drift more precisely. By the end of day 3, I had a clean graph. The drift was real, it was growing, and it wasn't random. Something in the predictive chain was feeding itself bad information and then trusting its own correction. It was the kind of loop that designers of critical systems spend their careers trying to avoid. And it was happening in ours, quietly, in the background, because somewhere in the original architecture 6 years earlier, someone had tied the safety net at one end to the thing it was supposed to catch. If I had put that graph in front of Howard, our senior engineer, he would have walked it upstairs within an hour. He was a careful man, a little self-important about being careful, the kind of person who said things like, "Let's not be too clever," in his second sentence of every meeting. I liked him, in the way you like people whose virtues you don't have. He was the exact right person to tell. I didn't tell him. I told myself I wanted to rule out sensor error first. I want to be honest with you about what I was actually protecting, because it wasn't my job. My job was secure. I was senior enough that flagging a problem, even a wrong one, wouldn't have cost me anything more than a little embarrassment. What I was protecting was more delicate than employment. I had spent 2 decades building a reputation for seeing things other people missed, and part of that reputation depended on me being right when I finally spoke. If I raised an alarm and the drift turned out to be a calibration issue in a rural substation, I'd still have my job, but I wouldn't be the man who only speaks when it matters. I'd just be another analyst who'd had a nervous week. I didn't want to be that. I wanted to be sure. And underneath the wanting to be sure, I wanted to be the one who solved it quietly and then mentioned it almost in passing, the way I'd mentioned the transformer thing in 2019. That's the shape of it. I can dress it up, but that's the shape. Vanity disguised as rigor. By day 5, I had stopped sleeping well. My wife, Marta, noticed, because Marta notices everything and pretends not to, which is one of her kindnesses. She asked me at breakfast if something was wrong at work, and I said we were chasing a ghost in the model, which was true enough to feel honest and vague enough to protect me. She nodded and passed me the jam. I remember thinking later that she had given me 3 chances in that single exchange to actually say what was happening, and I had taken none of them. She is not a technical person, but she is a person who listens without interrupting. And if I had laid the graph on the kitchen table, she would have asked me the one question I was avoiding asking myself, which was why I hadn't told anyone at work yet. On day 6, I almost did. I walked to Howard's office with the printout in a manila folder, and I stood in his doorway, and he looked up with that patient expression of his, and I asked him if he had a minute to look at something odd. He said, of course. I sat down. I opened the folder, and then I don't quite know how to describe what happened. I heard my own voice frame the issue as a curiosity rather than a concern. I said I was seeing some interesting drift behavior in the long-term forecast and was thinking about writing it up for the quarterly review. He leaned over, looked at the graph for maybe 15 seconds, said it was probably seasonal adjustment bleeding into the model, and told me to put it in the review if I thought it was worth a slide. I thanked him. I left. I closed the folder, and I walked back to my desk with a feeling I can still put my hand on, which was relief, mixed with shame, in the ratio of about 80 to 20. The shame was there. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But the relief was louder, and the relief was what I followed. If you've ever done this, you know what I mean, not the grid part. The part where you ask a question in a way that guarantees you won't get the answer you're afraid of. I think most people have done some version of it. And I think most people, like me, prefer not to think about how often. If you recognize the feeling, you don't have to say it out loud. Just notice that you recognize it. That's enough. That's actually the point. Day 7 was a Sunday. I went to my daughter's volleyball tournament in a high school 2 towns over. She's 23 now and lives in Oregon. Back then she was 16 and serious about the sport in a way that I found beautiful and slightly intimidating. Between matches, she sat next to me on the bleachers and asked me if I was okay, and I told her I was tired. She said, "Dad, you've been tired for a week." And I said, "Yeah, I have been." She didn't push. She put her head on my shoulder for maybe 3 seconds, which was the longest she had done that in 2 years, and then she went back down to the court. I watched her serve. I thought, if I say something tomorrow, it won't be too late. It was a clean, reasonable thought. It felt like a plan. I let it substitute for a decision. On day 8, the drift doubled, not in the graph I'd been keeping, in the raw numbers. The model was correcting in increments that should have triggered a secondary flag, but the secondary flag system used the same predictive input, so it was interpreting the larger corrections as normal adaptive behavior. I sat at my desk, and I watched the corrections climb, and I understood fully, for the first time, what I was looking at. It was a feedback loop inside a system whose architects had assumed its own self-assessment was trustworthy. The safety net was tied, at one end, to the thing it was supposed to catch. I felt almost tender toward the engineers who had built it 6 years earlier, because I could see how reasonable their decisions had been, and how reasonable decisions had nonetheless added up to a blind spot. And in the next breath I understood that I was now one of those engineers. I had seen it, and I had said nothing, and my silence was now part of the architecture. That evening I did something I still think about. I stayed late. Everyone else had gone. The control room was down to the hum of the HVAC and the soft blue glow of the wall monitors. I pulled a chair over in front of the main display, and I sat there for maybe 40 minutes, watching the drift in real time, watching the corrections, watching the model lie to itself and trust the lie. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat. I remember thinking that if I were watching this on someone else's shift, if this were someone else's failure to escalate, I would already be composing, in my head, the disciplinary conversation that person deserved. I would be strict. I would be the strict voice in the room. And I was sitting there, alone, in the chair, a man who had every tool and every title and every year of experience required to act. And I was not acting. I was watching. And the watching felt almost peaceful, the way a secret can feel peaceful when you're the only one who knows it. I went home and told Marta I was going to bring something up at work the next day that might be a big deal. She asked what it was. I said I'd tell her after. She looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Okay," and she went to bed. I stayed up in the kitchen with a glass of water and rehearsed what I was going to say to Denise in the morning. I had the sentences ready. I had the graph ready. I had even rehearsed the tone, grave, but not panicked, the tone of a man who had done his due diligence and was now acting responsibly. I went to bed at 2 in the morning, and I slept for the first time in a week. I want you to notice something, because it matters for what comes next. I slept because I had made the decision, not because I had acted on it. The decision itself was enough to release the tension in my body. I woke up on day 9, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. I drove to work with the folder on the passenger seat. I walked into the building with the folder under my arm. I sat down at my desk, opened my email just to clear it. And there was a note from Denise, sent at 4 in the morning, saying she was out for the day with a family emergency and please route urgent items to Howard. I closed my email. I looked at the folder. I thought, I'll wait for Denise. It's her shift. She should hear it first. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I've had to sit with it for years, because it is the exact sentence a coward uses when he has been given one more chance to be careful and has chosen instead to be careful about being seen, to be careful. Howard was in his office. I could see him through the glass. I could have walked in. I didn't. I worked on other things for the rest of the day. I watched the drift climb. I told myself Denise would be back tomorrow. Denise came back the next morning, day 10, and she was in a mood that anyone who has ever worked in an office will recognize. Her mother had fallen. She had driven 3 hours in the dark. She was trying to catch up on 2 days of email and also pretend she was fine. I watched her for about 40 minutes, and I decided this wasn't the day either. I told myself I was being considerate. I was being something, but considerate wasn't the word for it. I went home that night, and I didn't tell Marta I hadn't spoken up. I let her assume I had. I didn't lie with words. I lied with the shape of my silence at dinner, which was the shape of a man who had handled something. If you have ever managed your own guilt by letting someone you love misunderstand you in a direction that flatters you, you know the specific flavor of that evening. I ate lasagna. I complimented the lasagna. I asked about her day. I went to bed early. I slept badly again, because the decision had been unmade by the not acting, and my body knew. I dreamed that night of a number rising on a screen. No context, just the number. When I woke, I couldn't remember what number it had been, only that it was too high. Day 11 was a Thursday. I remember it was a Thursday because Thursday was the day the regional coordinators did their weekly call, and I had been half hoping, the way you half hope for things you refuse to actually arrange, that someone on that call would notice something and ask a question that would let me volunteer my data without it being my initiative. That was the fantasy I was running on by then. I had moved from wanting to speak to wanting to be asked. It's a smaller, uglier posture, and I knew it even while I was in it. The call happened. Nobody asked. I sat at my desk afterward and watched the model. Outside it had started to rain, a thin, steady rain that you only noticed if you looked at the parking lot window. A maintenance guy was mopping near the break room in long, careful passes. The fluorescent light above my row had that faint, almost flicker it had been doing for months, just on the edge of real, and I had the thought, stupidly, that I should put in a ticket for it. That was what my mind was doing. It was filing small tickets about small things while a large thing got larger. At 11:43, the drift crossed a threshold it had been flirting with for 2 days. At 11:45, the model stopped making corrections and started issuing commands. Not to my terminal, to the dispatch chain. Small commands at first. The automated load-balancing language the system used to rebalance flows across substations. Nothing that, in isolation, would have looked wrong to anyone glancing at a dashboard. I wasn't glancing at a dashboard. I'd been watching the underlying variable for 11 days, and I knew exactly what I was seeing. At 11:46, the first shed happened. A small one, a test, almost, from the system's perspective. It shed a block of industrial load in the eastern sector. The next shed was queued 40 seconds behind it. The one after that was queued 40 seconds behind that. I could see the queue. I could see the pattern. In 90 seconds, the cascade was going to reach the substations, feeding a hospital, a water treatment plant, and about 40,000 residential customers on the east side of our service area. The backup generators at the hospital would probably kick in, because backup power mostly works. The water treatment plant would hold for a while. The residential customers would be fine, more or less. The harm in the likely scenario was real, but not catastrophic. The harm to me, however, was about to be catastrophic. Because the moment the cascade hit, there would be an investigation, and the investigation would look at query logs, and the query logs would show that one senior analyst had been pulling the exact data stream that predicted this exact event for 11 consecutive days. And then the investigation would not be about the model. It would be about the analyst. I want you to hold both of those realities in your head at the same time, the way I had to hold them in mine, in a span of about 6 seconds. I had read access. I couldn't issue commands. But I had, over the years, built a small utility on my own terminal that let me send a manually formatted alert packet directly into the dispatcher queue at our sister facility. It was a gray area tool. It wasn't forbidden, exactly, because nobody had thought to forbid it. I had built it during a bad ice storm in 2017 when our internal messaging was down and I'd needed to get information to a dispatcher fast. I had never deleted it. I had used it maybe 4 times since, always for minor things, always with a kind of private pride that I had this quiet little lever. I used it that Thursday. I typed a short alert. I said the predictive model was in an unstable correction loop, and that manual override of the shed protocol was required immediately. I sent it to the dispatch floor in our sister facility, which had command authority we didn't. I sent it under my own name. I hit send at 11:47 and 22 seconds. The dispatcher on the other end, a woman named Ruth, whom I had never met in person, read it within 40 seconds and made the call to manually freeze the shed protocol at 11:48 and 15 seconds. The cascade didn't happen. The hospital kept its power. The water treatment plant kept its power. 40,000 people kept their lights on and never knew. I sat at my desk afterward, and my hands were shaking in a way they had never shaken before, not even when my father died. And I understood, with a clarity that has not left me since, that I had just used my access to cover the consequences of my silence. I want to be careful here, because I can feel myself wanting to soften this. The people kept their power. That's a real good. Ruth made a real decision based on a real alert, and she did her job well, and nothing I say next should take that away from her. But the alert I sent her didn't say I've been watching this for 11 days. It said the model is in an unstable correction loop, as if I had just noticed, and everyone who read it afterward, and there were people who read it afterward, read it as the work of a vigilant analyst who had caught something in real time. I was praised for it, quietly, in the way our field praises things. Denise got off her call, saw what had happened, came to my desk, and said, "Good catch." Howard stopped by later in the afternoon, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "That was sharp of you." I said, "Thank you." I didn't say anything else. Take a moment, if you're listening to this while you're doing something else, and ask yourself what you would have said in that moment, when the hand was on your shoulder. I'm not asking rhetorically. I've asked myself for years, and I don't have a clean answer, and I'd be curious whether you do. Most people I've ever discussed this kind of thing with tell me they would have confessed right there. I used to believe them. I don't anymore. The rest of that afternoon at my desk, is still lit in my head in a particular way. The fluorescent light above me was still doing its almost flicker. The maintenance guy had finished mopping and put the yellow cone away. Someone was microwaving something that smelled like canned soup. I answered 3 emails about a completely unrelated matter. I got up and refilled my mug with coffee I didn't want. I stood at the window and watched the rain thin out over the parking lot. A colleague 2 desks down was laughing at something on her phone. The whole floor had the exact same texture it had had at 9 in the morning. Nothing in the room registered what had almost happened. Nothing in the room registered what I had almost let happen. I think that was when it first opened inside me, the gap between the world's view of me and mine. I could feel the gap as a physical thing. I could feel it widen in the space of an afternoon. I drove home that night, and Marta had made salmon, which is what she makes when she can tell I've had a hard day, even though I haven't told her it was a hard day. We ate on the back porch because it was still warm enough. There was a neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the block. I remember the sound of her fork on the plate. I remember thinking, I will tell her about this someday. I remember believing that. It felt, at the time, like a promise I was making to myself, the kind of promise a decent person makes to defer a hard conversation until they are ready. The investigation that followed was routine, and that's the part I want to slow down on, because routine was the most dangerous thing it could have been. The model was flagged for review. A team was assigned. They found the feedback loop within about 3 weeks, which is impressive, and they patched it within 2 months, which is also impressive. The report noted that an alert analyst had caught the anomaly in time to prevent a significant outage. I was named in the report, not prominently, just a line. My name next to the phrase, timely identification. I have a copy of that report in a drawer in my home office. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I know exactly which drawer it's in, and exactly how far back I'd have to reach to touch it. The thing nobody asked, and the thing I kept waiting for someone to ask, was how I had happened to be watching that specific metric at that specific second. It was not on any of my assigned dashboards. It was not part of my standard review. A curious investigator, one with time and suspicion, would have noticed that I'd been pulling related data queries for 11 days. The queries were logged. They existed. They sat at that moment on a backup drive in our facility, time-stamped, attributed, undeniable. For the first 2 weeks of the investigation, I could not make my hands warm. I am not being poetic. My fingers were cold at my desk, cold at home, cold at night in bed. I developed a physical tic of checking the internal audit portal 3 or 4 times a day, just to see if any log pull request had been made against my account. None had, but the checking itself was a new behavior, and it planted something in me I hadn't had before, which was a permanent awareness of the existence of the logs. Before the Thursday, logs had been abstract. After the Thursday, they were a shape on the edge of my vision. Specific, geographically located, a particular drive, in a particular rack, in a particular building. Physical objects I could have driven to in about 11 minutes. The investigators did 1 interview with me, about 10 days in. 2 people I didn't know, a woman with a tablet and a man who mostly listened. They were polite. They were thorough in the way people are thorough when they've already decided what they're looking for. They asked me to walk them through what I'd seen that afternoon. I walked them through it. I gave them the version where I had been doing routine monitoring and had noticed the anomaly in real time. The woman with the tablet asked me, as a sort of closing question, whether I had seen any earlier indicators that might have forecast the instability. I paused. I actually paused. And in that pause I could feel the whole next act of my life branching. Two possible versions of me standing in a doorway, waiting to see which one would walk through. And then I said, no, nothing that stood out at the time. The man who had been listening made a small note. The woman said, "Thank you." They left. I sat at my desk for a long time after they left. That was maybe the single worst hour I had in those months. Not because I thought I'd been caught. I hadn't. They had been perfectly satisfied. It was the worst hour because I could feel, with a new sharpness, that I had just committed the lie a second time, in a new setting, in front of witnesses with pens. The first lie, the lie of silence, had been passive. This lie had been spoken out loud. It was a different kind of object. It was heavier, and I had added it to myself voluntarily. I lived with that for about 6 months before it started to change me in ways I could feel from the inside. The first change was small. I stopped volunteering in meetings, not dramatically, just a quarter turn. Where I used to offer observations, I started waiting to be asked. I told myself I was learning to listen more. What I was actually doing was managing the risk that I might, in some unguarded moment, say something revealing. If you don't speak, you can't slip. I became, over the course of that year, a man known for his thoughtful silences. People started to read depth into my quiet. I didn't correct them. The second change was harder to notice because it happened in the way I talked to Marta. I had never told her the full story. I had told her there was a near miss at work and that I had caught it, and she had been proud of me in a brief, warm way, and then the subject had moved on, as subjects do in long marriages. But I started, without deciding to avoid conversations that got near the territory of professional integrity. When a news story came on about a whistleblower, I would change the subject. When she told me about something a co-worker of hers had done that she found dishonest, I would nod and agree in a way that closed the topic instead of opening it. She noticed. She didn't confront me. That's not how she operates. She just, over time, stopped bringing those things to me. She found other people to discuss them with. I could feel the small ways our conversation narrowed, and I told myself this was what marriage looks like at 25 years, a natural settling. It wasn't. It was a settling I had caused. My daughter left for college that next fall. I drove her out to her school, and we spent 4 days in a motel while she moved in, and on the last night, in a diner near campus, she asked me if I was happy at work. I said I was. She said, "You seem quieter lately." I said I was getting older. She laughed and said, "Dad, you've always been old." I laughed too. The conversation moved on, but I caught myself, in the car the next morning, rehearsing what I would have said if I had told her the truth. And I realized I had been rehearsing versions of that conversation for months, with different people, in my head, in the shower, in the car, in the minutes before sleep. I was telling the story over and over to an imaginary audience, and in each version I came out of it a slightly different man. In some versions I was a man who had made a mistake and recovered. In some versions, I was a man who had saved 40,000 people. In some versions, I was a man who had covered something up. I could move between the versions depending on what I needed that day. That's the part that's hardest to describe, and it's the part I want to spend some time on, because I think it's the part most people don't talk about when they talk about guilt. Guilt in movies is a single heavy thing you carry. Real guilt, at least the kind I've lived with, is more like a wardrobe. You dress the memory differently for different weather. A tough day calls for the version of the story where you saved people. A tender day with your wife calls for the version where you made a small mistake and handled it. A late insomniac night, when the house is cold and your body is being honest with you, calls for the real version, the one you sleep next to for the rest of your life. The skill you develop over years is knowing which version to reach for at which moment. It is not exactly dishonesty. It is not exactly honesty. It is a third thing, and our language doesn't quite have a word for it. And I think that's why it's so hard to stop. If that resonates, sit with it for a minute before we go on. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it. I just think it's something we don't say out loud often enough. And a video like this is probably one of the few places it can be said without anyone needing to respond. About 14 months after the Thursday, our company was acquired by a larger regional entity. I want to spend real time here, because this was the period in which the threat changed shape, and the shape it changed into was worse. The acquisition was routine and boring in its surface, and terrifying in its implications. Men in better suits than ours explained synergies in conference rooms that smelled of new carpet. A new compliance team was sent to our facility to inventory our systems. They were thorough. They were 26 years old, and they were thorough. That combination was new to me. My generation of compliance people had been older and tired. The new ones were young and interested, which is a different animal entirely. They asked, in a plenary meeting, whether anyone had custom utilities on their terminals that should be logged for compliance. I watched that question land in the room. I watched people shift in their chairs. I had a decision to make, in real time, in front of my colleagues, about whether to mention my alert packet tool. I mentioned it. I mentioned it in a flat, technical way, as one of several small scripts I'd written over the years, and I framed it as a legacy workaround from the 2017 ice storm. The compliance officer nodded and made a note. I was asked to document it properly or deprecate it. I chose deprecation. I watched the script get deleted from my terminal the following Tuesday. A young man I didn't know stood behind me and observed while I removed the file and confirmed the removal. The file name disappeared from the directory. He marked a box on a tablet. He thanked me and moved on. I felt, for a small moment, a relief that was not quite a relief, because I knew what I had just done. I had removed the tool that had saved me, but I had also removed the tool that could, theoretically, have been cross-referenced against the logs. The logs, though, were on a different system, and they were part of standard data retention, and they were going to sit on that backup drive for 7 years under internal policy. I knew the retention period. I counted forward. I marked, in my head, the year they would age out. That year, if you're doing the math with me, is this year. I have been aware of that year at a low hum for most of 16 years. Not every day, but often enough that I know what month it falls in. Often enough that when I read a news story about an old case reopened because someone pulled archived data, something in my chest tightens briefly and then releases. The compliance transition also brought interviews, standard ones. Every senior analyst sat with 2 people and answered questions about history, tooling, incidents of note. Mine was scheduled for a Thursday, which I noticed and hated. The interview room was a glass-walled box on the 2nd floor that everyone could see into. They left the blinds open. I remember thinking of all the small cruelties that one was not one they intended. They asked me about the model event, the one from the previous year. They asked me to walk them through it again. They had the report in front of them. I walked them through it again. This time one of them, a man maybe 35 years old with a very still face, asked me a question the earlier investigators hadn't asked. He said, "In the course of your normal work, how often did you review the underlying forecast drift variable?" I felt my hands go cold, the way they had gone cold at my desk after the Thursday. I said, "Not often, only when I was looking for something specific." He wrote that down. He did not follow up. He moved to the next question. I do not know to this day whether he was asking because he suspected something or whether he was reading questions off a list. I have replayed his still face many times, and I cannot decide. What I know is that I lived for the next 11 days, the number returned, in a state of low-grade dread, waiting to see if a follow-up request came. None did. The interview was filed. The compliance transition rolled forward. I survived it. The word survived is the word I used to myself at the time, and it's the word I'd still use, because that's what it felt like, a thing I had survived rather than a thing that had ended well. There were other near misses over the years, smaller, and for a while I tracked them the way a person with a heart condition tracks episodes. A graduate student doing research on automated load systems sent a polite email asking if I would be willing to be interviewed about our model event. I wrote back a polite no, citing confidentiality. She wrote back a polite thanks, and that was the end of it. But for a week after, every time my email notification chimed, I had the brief thought that she had found something and followed up. A former colleague ran into me at a regional conference and mentioned, in passing, that he had always been curious how I had noticed the drift so fast. I gave a vague answer about pattern recognition and changed the subject. For 3 months after that conversation, I expected his name in my inbox. It never came. I want to try to describe what it is like to live, for years, inside that kind of attention to detail about your own vulnerability. It is not dramatic. That is the thing most people misunderstand about it. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. I went to work. I came home. I went on vacations. I had dinners with friends. I watched my daughter graduate from college in a hot auditorium in Oregon, where a bee got in, and everyone pretended not to notice. The secret did not feel, in any given hour, like a loud thing. It felt like a dimmer switch that had been turned down on certain rooms of my life. There were topics I couldn't enter. There were people whose questions I subtly routed away from. There were moments, tiny ones, when I caught myself calibrating my tone with a precision that would have embarrassed me if I'd let myself see it clearly. I did not let myself see it clearly. That was part of the skill. 3 years ago, I took early retirement. I didn't have to. I was 60, the financials worked, and nobody was pushing me out. But I had started to feel, in the last year of my work, that every day I stayed was another day I could slip, and another day I could be asked a question I didn't want to answer. More than that, I had started to feel like a fraud in a way that was making it hard to do the work well. When junior analysts came to me with questions about judgment, I could hear myself giving them advice I didn't believe in. I told them to speak up when they saw something. I told them that silence was the most expensive thing in our field. I told them these things, and I watched their faces accept the advice, and I went home feeling sick. So I retired. I told Marta it was time. She was surprised. She asked if I was sure. I said I was. She was glad in the end, because she had been ready for me to be home, and we had plans, and some of those plans have been good. Retirement has been strange in the specific way it's strange when you leave a job that contained a secret. The secret came with me. I thought for a while that leaving the building would weaken the hold of it, the way leaving a bad relationship weakens the hold of the relationship. It hasn't worked that way. If anything, without the daily structure of the work, the secret has more room. It wanders around the house. It sits with me when I read in the evening. It is quieter now than it was, but it is also more present, because there is less noise to cover it. I have not told Marta. I have come close, twice. The first time was about 2 years ago, on a trip to the coast, when we were walking on a beach at low tide, and she said something about how lucky we were to have made it to this point without any real disasters. I almost said, "I have one." I almost told her. I remember feeling the shape of the sentence in my mouth. But I looked at her face, calm and warm, and a little sunburned, and I thought, what am I about to do to this afternoon? What am I about to ask her to carry? And I decided, in a way that felt both generous and cowardly, that my confession would be a gift to me and a burden to her, and that I didn't have the right to trade her peace for mine. So I said, yeah, we have been lucky, and we walked on. The second time was last spring. Our daughter was visiting from Oregon. She's a social worker now, and she was telling us about a client she'd been working with, a man in his 60s who had held a secret from his family for 30 years and had finally told them, and it had gone badly, and he had come to her office not knowing what to do. She was telling us this as a professional story, the way she tells professional stories, with care for the client's dignity and some frustration at the messiness of the outcome. And I asked her, trying to sound casual, what she thought the man should have done. She thought about it for a while. She said, "Honestly, Dad, I don't know. I think sometimes the people we love don't want our truths. They want our presence. And sometimes the truth is what we owe them, and not telling it is its own kind of absence." She said she didn't have a rule for it. She said she thought it probably depended on what the truth was and what the telling was for. I nodded. Marta was in the kitchen. My daughter looked at me for a beat longer than she needed to, and then she changed the subject. And I don't know, to this day, whether she knew she was looking at a man in the same shape as her client, or whether I was projecting that onto a kind look. I think about Ruth sometimes, the dispatcher. She retired a couple of years before I did, and I never met her, and I have, once or twice, considered writing her a letter. I haven't, and I won't, because a letter from me would require me to explain why I was writing, and any honest explanation would put her in a position of having to decide what to do with the information. She did her job well on a Thursday, 16 years ago, and she got to carry that as a clean memory, and I don't have the right to complicate it. If you've ever chosen not to tell someone something because you decided their peace was worth more than your relief, you know the exact texture of that choice. It is not entirely noble. Some of it is noble, and some of it is convenience, and the two are braided so tightly you can't separate them. There's a thing I've been circling, and I want to say it plainly. The reason I used my access that Thursday, the real reason, was not to save the grid. I want to believe that. I have tried to believe that. But when I am honest with myself, at the end of a long day when the house is quiet, I know that I used my access to save myself. The grid was going to go down, yes, and people were going to be inconvenienced, and the hospital would have switched to backup power, which would have worked. Probably, because backup power mostly works. The actual harm, in the likely scenario, would have been real but not catastrophic. What would have been catastrophic for me, was the investigation that followed, because that investigation would have found my query logs, and those logs would have told a story my name could not have survived. So I used the tool I had built for emergencies to prevent an emergency I had helped cause. And I did it fast enough that the story of my alertness replaced the story of my silence. I traded one narrative for another in the 90 seconds I had, and I chose the narrative I could live inside. That's the sentence I have been trying to write for 16 years. On the page, it looks small. In my chest, it is not small. A few months ago, I started volunteering at a community center about 20 minutes from our house. They needed someone to help with their backup generator system and the building's electrical, and I know how to do that. And I had time. I like the work. I like the people, most of whom don't know what I used to do for a living beyond something with computers and power. There's a woman there, about my age, who runs the food program, and she was having trouble with the walk-in cooler last month, and I helped her figure it out. It turned out to be a bad relay. Nothing dramatic. But we had been standing in the walk-in, in our coats, while she explained the symptoms to me. And she said, "I've been ignoring this for 3 weeks because I was afraid it was going to be expensive, and now the whole thing almost died." And I said, "That happens. That's how these things usually go. Small thing, ignored until it's not small." I heard myself say it. I heard myself say it the way a person says something they don't know they know. I stood in that cold room, and I thought, I am still saying this to people. I am still giving this advice. I am still, somehow, the man who knows how these things work. The knowledge didn't save me from doing it. It hasn't saved anyone I've ever talked to, either, probably. Most of us know. Most of us do it anyway. I don't know what that says about knowledge, or about people, or about me. I used to think knowing was most of it. I don't think that anymore. If you've stayed with me this far, and I appreciate that you have, I want to say one thing that isn't a lesson, because I promised myself I wouldn't offer any. It's an observation, from inside the kind of life I've ended up with. The thing you don't say changes shape over time. At first, it's a fact, a specific event with specific details, and you think if you can just keep the fact contained, you'll be fine. But facts don't stay facts inside a person. They become pressure. The pressure shapes how you stand, how you listen, how you answer questions you weren't expecting, how close you let people get. After enough years, the original fact is almost beside the point. What you're living with is the shape the fact gave you, and the shape is harder to address than the fact, because you can't confess a shape. You can only notice it, and try not to inflict it, and fail, and notice again. I notice it in how I am with Marta on Sunday mornings. I notice it in the way I answer the phone when my daughter calls. I notice it in the brief coolness I feel toward people who speak too confidently about their own integrity. I notice it when I drive past the old building, which I do maybe twice a year because it's on the way to a hardware store I like. The building is the same flat gray rectangle it always was. There are different cars in the lot now. The coffee maker has probably been replaced, or maybe not. The carpet is probably the same. Someone is sitting at what used to be my desk, looking at screens I no longer have access to, and maybe that person is a better version of me, and maybe they aren't. And either way, the grid is running, and the drift, whatever drift is there now, is their drift, and I am not watching it anymore. I said at the beginning that I had access to the system, and I used it once. That's true in the literal sense. I sent one alert packet that mattered, under my own name, on a Thursday at 11:47 and 22 seconds. But there's another sense in which I used that access every day for 11 days before the Thursday, by watching and not speaking and deciding hour by hour that my quiet was worth more than whatever was building on the other side of it. That's the use I don't have a clean word for. That's the use that has followed me into rooms where the system is nowhere around. 6 years later, sitting in a different kitchen in the same house, I am still not ready. And the word ready has started to feel like a place I am never going to arrive at. Maybe readiness was never the right frame. Maybe the question was always just whether I was willing. And willing is a smaller, harder word. And I have not been willing. And I am telling you this now, in a room she is not in, because telling a stranger costs me less than telling her. And I know that, and I am doing it anyway. And that is also part of the shape. There's a particular kind of light in our kitchen in the late afternoon in October. It comes in low through the window over the sink and catches the dust and makes the whole room look like it's underwater. I've been noticing it more lately. I don't know if it's because I'm home during that hour now, or because my eyes are different at 63 than they were at 47. Marta will come in, eventually, and ask what I want for dinner, and I will say whatever she wants, and she will say, "That's not helpful," and I will smile, and we will decide, together, the way we always do, and the Thursday will be where it always is, under everything, not loud, not gone. I used to think that if I ever told this story out loud, even once, something in me would loosen. I had a picture of it, honestly. I pictured myself lighter afterward, the way people describe feeling after a long cry. I've told it now. I don't feel lighter. I feel more specific. The story has a shape outside me now for the first time, and the shape looks about the way I was afraid it would look, which is smaller than my guilt and larger than my excuses, and those two measurements don't cancel each other out. They just both exist. I don't know who's watching this. I don't know what you came here for. If you were hoping for something cleaner, I'm sorry. If you've been carrying something of your own, and you came here because the title caught at a place in you, I understand, and I won't pretend I have advice. I'll only say this because I think it's the only thing I've actually learned. The version of yourself you protect with silence is not the version of yourself you get to keep. Something else grows in that space. It isn't evil. It isn't even dramatic. It's just a slightly different person, quieter, more careful, more alone in a way that doesn't show from the outside. You get used to them. They become you. And one afternoon years later, you sit in a kitchen in a light you've started to notice, and you realize the person you are trying to protect is the person you haven't been for a long time. The logs age out this year. I know the month. I have known the month for a long time. And I have caught myself lately, hoping the date will pass without my noticing it, the way you hope an anniversary will pass when you're trying not to mark it. But I will notice. I notice everything. That was always the problem. That was always the shape. When the date comes, nothing will happen. No call, no letter, no knock. The drive will be wiped in a routine maintenance cycle by a technician who will not know what the drive contained, and the last physical evidence of what I did on that Thursday, and of what I did not do in the 11 days before it, will stop existing in the world. I used to think I wanted that day to arrive. I thought it would be the end of something. I have come to understand, slowly, that it will be the opposite. It will be the moment my story becomes, finally and completely, a thing only I remember. There will be no possibility of being found out. There will be no possibility of the world correcting the record. Whatever I choose to do with the truth from that day forward will be a choice I make alone, and I already know what I will choose, because I have been choosing it for 16 years, and the practice has made me good at it. That's the part I didn't understand when I was 47. I thought the danger was exposure. The danger was never exposure. The danger was this. A quiet afternoon in a kitchen I know too well. A light I've started to notice. A wife in the next room. A daughter on a phone call I will answer warmly and carefully. And a man I don't entirely recognize, who has become, without any single visible moment of becoming, the version of me that the silence chose. I used the access once. That's what the record says. That's what I said at the beginning. I want to end by telling you the truer version, which is that the access used me every day after. For the rest of a life, I am still, somehow, calling mine.